For a long time, I've been eager to dive into this episode. The sixth episode of the miniseries Band of Brothers, Bastogne, stands out among the other 9 episodes. That is, right after the events of Episode 5, when the 101st Airborne Division was seen making their way towards Bastogne. Throughout this episode, we followed Dr. Eugene Roe as ZZ Company faced harsh conditions without adequate supplies, enough manpower, or protective gear. This is one of my favorite episodes for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that the environment is an adversary on par with the Germans on the other side of the queue. Having said that, let us not waste any more time and get into this episode, dissecting it for all its valuable lessons. Bastogne, the 6th episode of Band of Brothers, is broken down here. This video contains spoilers just so you are aware. The interviews, aside from the series finale, every single episode of Band of Brothers begins with interviews. What made this round of interviews stand out from the others, though, was that they were focused on a real-life scenario that the men were facing. This episode comes after a string of ones that dealt with human characteristics and emotions and how those characters triumphed against adversity. Captain Winter's leadership, Blythe's terror, and the reactions of others were all factors. Now that we're well into the show's runtime, we begin to empathize with the characters, and the spotlight should be on the difficult circumstances in which these men were trapped. Something that we were already aware would have accentuated all of those characteristics and feelings nevertheless. This episode's interviewees included Carwood Lipton, J.B. Earl McClung, Hank Zimmerman, Herbert Seaworth Jr. and Lester Hashi, Newton Abbott. The men were all reminiscing about their experience in Bastogne, the location the 101st Airborne Division was seen advancing towards in the 5th episode's finale. According to what we heard, the fog wouldn't lift, the Germans knew exactly where they were, and they were woefully unprepared. Sometimes supplies would even fall over the border, falling into the hands of the Germans, and they wouldn't even drop for them. But I was most struck by 2 lines of conversation that emerged from these encounters. "I believe a medic saved my life once he arrived," Herbert Seaworth Jr. remarked in the first. Our guide for this episode was Easy Company medic Eugene Roe, whose point of view we were unaware of at the time. This statement therefore established the groundwork for the episode's plot and the significance of medics on the battlefield. The last line as well. "Mr. BB, even on a really chilly night," Stokes added. His wife would tell you that he says, "I'm glad I'm not in Bastogne before going to bed." We were able to envision how things would have been when they were there because of this, which did really set the groundwork. Nothing, though, could have prepared us for the merciless conditions we witnessed later on in the episode. This episode's interviews were well executed. They gave the impression that they were attempting to give us a mental image of what we would see. We had a solid foundation and understanding from hearing from the real-life veterans beforehand, which allowed us to continually return to throughout one of the best episodes of the season. I was immediately transported back to the Band of Brothers universe, the moment this episode began because of the first creative choice that was made. As the episode transitioned from black to white, the only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the sound of labored breathing. Upon further inspection, the picture showed nothing but white. The message that these soldiers were really freezing from a lack of supplies and equipment was immediately sent to us, and it was clear that the creators intended for us to feel cold as well. In the backdrop, among the sound of the snow falling, we could hear the eerie sound of gunfire, serving as a reminder of their purpose. Here, the men weren't merely engaged in combat with the enemy across the line. They were also contending with the elements, which presented a fresh obstacle in comparison to their previous endeavors. Doc Roe was introduced right away. We would later see him in passing in several episodes, including 3 when Blythe was at the aid station and 5 when Moose Heilager appeared anxious and irritated with Winters after being shot at by his own guy. As soon as we saw that Eugene was scouring the area for anything he could use on the men in his next raid, we knew that they were short on supplies. On more than one occasion, he came perilously close to crossing enemy territory, and there were instances when enemy forces crossed the line and encircled the 101st. Even while it didn't seem like a big deal at the moment, the story progressed, and we realized how crucial the lives of the men ahead of him were. Their significance was universally acknowledged, but it became clear towards the conclusion that he had witnessed a great deal of mortality, which was affecting his psyche. His quest for supplies symbolized the concern and necessity to ease this impact. From what we gathered, the men were making gains on one side of the structure, but eventually losing ground on the other. The fact that they were essentially confined inside further demonstrated how fruitless their efforts had been thus far, and the men had to endure the terrible weather while doing little to advance their cause, all because they lacked the resources to gain an advantage. As part of the actual siege of Bastogne, bad weather was a major factor that halted Allied supply flights to the besieged city and ground assaults against German positions. The opening part and episode really drove home the point that this winter was the worst anyone has ever seen. It became clear that Doc Roe was dealing with a mountain of issues. Take Garnier, for instance. He claimed to be peeing needles. Toy's feet were all screwed up from losing his boots. Roe, on the other hand, was searching for supplies and trying to contact Doc Ryan. And let's not forget about the others who came to him for personal help, rather than injuries. Because neither an aid station nor a surgeon were available, he was left to bear the whole weight of the situation. Near this point in the show, the guys were talking about peering over the queue and asking, "Do you see them? You can find them." Even though they couldn't see the adversary through the fog, they knew that if they even looked away from the queue for a second, death would be waiting for them. The significance of the weather at Bastogne, which worked against them at that precise moment, is once again demonstrated. Approximately 11 minutes into the show, the characters were in the midst of a conversation when suddenly, out of nowhere, there was mayhem, and I couldn't help but jump because I wasn't prepared for it. Given that this is how it would have felt to be in the middle of a discussion when suddenly you find yourself battling for your life once more, the execution was spot on. Heffron then made his first appearance in the program after this, coughing the whole time. Although Heffron's given name was Edward, he was more commonly known as Babe. Babe was perplexed and even a little irritated that Eugene didn't use his nickname. After all, only certain people, like doctors and professionals, as well as his own mother, used his first name. Eugene, in contrast to many of the men there and their behavior throughout the first 5 episodes, never truly referred to anybody by a nickname, but always by their first name. Here I believe we may trace it back to the sheer volume of mortality that Doc Roe had witnessed during his lifetime. Being a medic, he appeared emotionally distant and physically disfigured from witnessing so much tragedy. He demonstrated a degree of detachment by not getting too close to individuals to know their nicknames or even their names correctly. This was to protect himself from more harm in the event that the people he got close to were slain. Still, he went out of his way to assist those in his immediate vicinity, even though he felt emotionally distant from them. After Sisk sustained his wounds, Eugene accompanied him back into town. It was during this time that we met Nurse Renee, a memorable character from the show who makes a brief appearance in this episode. While Eugene was fighting on the front lines, Renee, a nurse in town, was enduring much of the same hardships. With no supplies on hand, the constant presence of death was portrayed to us by the disturbing image of the dead piled outside, and with no backup other than Bastogne, the nurses were essentially cut off from the rest of the world. The story may be fictional, but it doesn't diminish the beauty it represented. Renee Lemaire was a real Belgian nurse who worked at the Bastogne aid station. It is unknown whether Roe ever met Renee in fact, though. During this time, Renee didn't get much food or rest since she helped care for 150 severely injured troops every day, prioritizing their needs over her own. The bond that Renee and Roe develop on the show is based on mutual respect and the ability to provide care in the midst of tragedy. Despite everything, there are still decent people in the world who can make a difference. On Christmas Eve, a bomb struck the aid station directly, killing Renee. This tragedy is depicted near the end of the program. In actuality, this did take place, and Renee did really die in that manner. Reportedly, she rescued 6 soldiers from the structure before succumbing to her injuries, while returning to save a 7th. I don't know what else to say about the heroic and remarkable Renee Lemaire if that doesn't convey it. Many of the men went for a hunt and surged forward over the line when Roe returned to Bastogne, but he was ordered to remain back. While the men were engaged in combat with the Germans, the scene cut back to Roe, who was seated in the forest, listening to the sound of gunfire. His visage was devoid of emotion as he sat there, seemingly aware that the sound of gunfire likely symbolized the loss of life and his own powerlessness to intervene. Julian had to be left behind here after being injured and killed in action. It was a tragic scene in the show because it was the first time we'd seen wounded people abandoned, and the men's guilt over abandoning him was palpable. Everyone there was aware that they were inviting death if they dared to pursue him. Since Heffron and Julian were close friends, the loss of Julian hit him harder than anybody else. Evidently, Heffron was unable to follow through on his promise to retrieve Julian's possessions and return them to his family in the event of an emergency. In actuality, they actually obtained Julian's corpse at nightfall and then asked Babe if he wanted to see his friend who had passed away. Because Heffron was unsure he could deal with meeting his friend in that light, he declined to see him. Supposedly, Babe carried the weight of Julian's death with him after the battle ended. To Babe's surprise, Julian was among the guys who would perish. They were each other's protectors, and he had the impression that Julian was an honest man. Upon meeting Julian's mother after the war, Babe sobbed uncontrollably. Additionally, he presented her with a regimental scrapbook, an item he believed Julian would have wished for his mother to own. We never saw Julian's body being retrieved, so that was one small variation in the show. In my opinion, the discussion that transpired within the foxhole's tarpaulin was crucial. We witnessed Heffron's grief over his friend's death, Joe's exhaustion from being a doctor, and Eugene's indignation at being a doctor. In the foxhole, you could have heard the voices of at least 3 distinct perspectives. The combination of Roe's body language and mental signals indicated that he was probably finished, but he knew he couldn't say it aloud for fear it would become true. Following this, we entered the episode's second to last half, where we observed a minor clearing of the fog and the subsequent dropping of supplies into the town. A man who was near death was there at the aid station as Eugene entered. Even when Eugene stepped in to offer a hand, I felt completely powerless in that terrifying moment. It was incredibly painful to witness the blood gargling, the heavy bandages covered with blood being tossed about, and the constant reminder of the impending death. There were 3 individuals huddled around one man, indicating that they were doing everything in their power to rescue him, but it was in vain. As a result, we saw how the weight of war affects individuals and how it spreads to affect others. After this, Eugene told Renee, "Your touch soothes people. It's a gift from God." Renee said, "I never want to treat a wounded man again." And the conversation ended there. They were both aware that they had to keep going if they didn't want more people to perish, and she was practically speaking the same hollowness and anguish that Roe was experiencing inside at the time. At one point, when Roe was once again among the men, Eugene froze as Smokey took a blow. As if he were a prisoner in his own head, he was unresponsive to the world around him and unsure of what to do. As a character, Roe lacked feelings, which is understandable given that he spent much of his day tending to injured and deceased individuals. We observed him begin to delve deeper into his own thoughts and feelings at this point. Because there was so much death around him, he was on the verge of losing his mind and being paralyzed. Once again, demonstrating his exceptional leadership approach, Captain Winters was acutely aware that it was finally wearing him down. Another unusual thing that happened in this episode was that Buck's partner broke up with him while he was in the military. It's not something that most people think about. Nonetheless, I think it actually occurred, and Buck was unable to do anything except chuckle about it. Something like this was a stepping stone on the road to the mentality we witnessed in episode 7. This was probably simply another low point for him. His attitude had been steadily declining since his injury in episode 4, and he seemed to have changed drastically since then. In the episode's last seconds, Harry took a hit, and after Roe helped him get up, he was once again frozen. Winters then dispatched him to town to acquire food and sleep. Upon arrival, however, he noticed that Bastogne had been attacked. Amidst the debris, he discovered the blue headband that Renee wore whenever he saw her, indicating that she was among the casualties. There was a tragic scene in the episode that demonstrated the harsh reality of battle, death, and casualties. As anticipated, Eugene seemed oblivious to the pain. It was clear he was in agony, but he seemed to be at a loss for what to do. The conflict was taking many lives, and Renee was just another number, casualty, human being, and person he had grown to care about who perished. On his way back with the men, Eugene approached Heffron, who he unconsciously referred to as Babe the first time he had ever done so. Eugene considered using Babe's blue headband to bandage her wound, but in the end, he decided to use Renee's. This seemed like a return to the idea that Renee's healing touch was a divine gift, demonstrating that she continued to aid the injured even after she passed away. It was a terrifying moment in an ongoing pattern. One of the last things we saw was the symbolic blood red stain on the ground, which signifies that death arrived in this episode and will come again. The episode ended with the same camera movement along the snow as it began, but this time the red of the blood contrasted with the white of the snow. Although he had no training in medicine before the war, the actual Eugene Roe enlisted in the 101st Airborne Division to serve as a medic. We saw that he didn't use people's nicknames, which likely reflects his alleged distancing from the camaraderie among the fighting personnel. Regardless, he was lauded for his extraordinary efforts in tending to the injured members of the business. In his efforts to provide the greatest assistance he could, he frequently sacrificed sleep and put himself in harm's path. After serving his country, Eugene Roe became a builder and had a child with his first wife, Vera. He later wed Myrtle, with whom he had 2 daughters. Eugene Roe, who tragically passed away at the age of 76 on December 30, 1998 from lung cancer, was never featured in the show or interviewed. In terms of overall enjoyment with the miniseries, I rank this episode right up there with episode 7. Although it is a bold claim, it lacks substance because every single item after Bastogne is great. As Doc Roe, I felt Shane Taylor was fantastic. He brilliantly portrayed the internal struggle that many people experience when they are emotionally distant from a situation, but still want to lend a hand and be involved. Because of the vital role that medics played in the war, I'm delighted we got to witness a narrative from their point of view. He's one of my favorite characters throughout the episode. The screen effectively conveyed the severe conditions for which Bastogne was infamous. There hasn't been a television program or movie that has done a greater job of capturing the chill of subzero temperatures than this one. I can't even begin to fathom the level of suffering these men endured due to their ill-preparedness and the frigid temperatures, but the play certainly conveyed that feeling. Visually, Bastogne was the most stunning episode of the season, if not the best, but it is a very essential point to make. The white covering of snow makes the surroundings seem almost romantic, yet the events that took place in the Ardennes forest were far from romantic, so it throws you for a loop when you're trying to form an emotional response. I will definitely be watching this episode again and again since it is so great. When I first began covering the show, I was most excited to rewatch this episode. Be sure to check back next week for the release of episode 7, titled The Breaking Point. It follows in the footsteps of Bastogne and is another fantastic episode, with its focus being on the Ardennes forest. The analysis of Band of Brothers episode 6 is now complete. Click the card in the upper corner to view more videos about Band of Brothers. Stay tuned because I will be covering all 10 episodes of the show, just as I have been covering every single one. Also, I covered Masters of the Air, and I'm considering adding the Pacific as well. If you're interested in seeing breakdowns for that region, please let me know. Of all the episodes of Band of Brothers, which one is your favorite? Post a comment telling me what you think. Please stay tuned for the next video, and I appreciate you watching this one.